So you have started the recording, Kelly.
I'm going to pause it. It started automatically.
I see.
Go ahead and do the best that we can. And the question came from one of you, is this going to be recorded? And I would say yes, because given all of the technological difficulties, we may very well want to have this available for people who weren't able to access today's session. And I want to welcome all of you. I think you know I'm John Buehrens. I've written a couple of books on Unitarian Universalist history. One of them I was going to hold up at this point, if I can find it. Oh, yes, because it's about to go out of print. And that's the one that I did a few years ago, 2011, I believe, for the 50th anniversary, no, 2013. 50th anniversary of the consolidation of the Universalists and Unitarians in America, A People's History. I'm going to be referring to wider issues than just Unitarian Universalism in San Francisco or California, because the basic thesis of this webinar in its 6 sessions is that the ups and downs that liberal religion goes through in America historically have more to do with changes in politics, economics, technology, culture, the religious context. And while it's important for us to position our congregations and our leadership to think strategically and to take advantage of those changes with clear mission focus, the big picture is that there's a lot of stuff, and this is something we should learn in religion, that is completely out of our control. Changes in economics, demography, politics, culture. These are the factors that cause Unitarian Universalism to go up and down. One of the puzzling things that I realized in writing these last 2 books of mine is that, the 2 greatest periods of Unitarian Universalist influence in the United States were in the 1860s and in the 1960s, in the middle of a civil war, and then in the middle of America's greatest cultural and political division prior to the present one, namely the division that was marked by the civil rights period and opposition to the Vietnam War. I lived through that. Some of you probably did, or at least it's closer history. This webinar is going to be divided into 2 parts, each of 3 sessions. The first one is much more historical. It will focus on today, the experiences of Unitarians and Universalists in the 19th century and early 20th century, up through about World War II, frankly. And then the 3 sessions after I come back from a family vacation in August that will focus on more contemporary events, many of which will be more familiar to all of us. So that's my self-introduction. I think you know that I'm a past president of the association. I'm just stepping down as we speak as the treasurer of the Unitarian Universalist Studies Network, in which Meg Richardson, who talked me into doing this webinar, is becoming a new trustee. And I want to commend that organization to all of you. I'm rather hoping that Arliss Unger, who signed up for this webinar, may be on that call and unable to join us today, but will join us later. She is actually as good a historian of the period I'm going to be discussing as I am. And I rather hope that she'll help us elucidate a few things. So let me now stop, and I believe that we have the capacity for each of you to speak. Is that right, Kelly?
Yes, everyone is equal as a panelist. They can
All right.
unmute themselves.
So may I ask that, I can't see everyone somehow in the present array. Probably has to do with how I set things up.
Is that better?
Yeah, I need the gallery view.
Okay,
Yeah.
that should help.
Thank you. Thank you. Barbara, would you introduce yourself? You and I know one another well.
Yes, Barbara Myers, a community minister and affiliated with the Mission Peak UU in Fremont. My ministry focuses on mental health issues and taken a number of John's classes at Starr King and other places, and I knew this was going to be good, so that's why I'm here.
And Serena, old friend, introduce yourself. You have to unmute.
I'm Serena McGuire, and I was a Unitarian minister, eventually evolved out of that and went to library school and was with the District of Columbia Public Library for 20 years. And I'm being joined by my brother, Michael McGuire, who's a longtime member of First Unitarian of Denver.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you, Serena. I'm delighted Serena did a ministerial internship with me some time ago, way back when. And Gretchen, would you introduce yourself, please, and unmute?
Yes. Hi, I'm Gretchen Levitt from UU Marin, and the history of our Bay Area intrigued me, so I signed up for the course.
Excellent. We're going to start with the Bay Area, but we're going to spread out and do a lot of context. If you want to understand anything about what goes on with a local congregation, you have to understand it in a much wider context. Susan.
My goodness, sometimes it's hard to hit that button, mute button.
Yeah.
I'm Susan Pantea. I am the serving as the minister for the Napa Valley Unitarian Universalists. I'll be there for another year, which is great. And yeah, and I'm not that long out of school, so it seems natural to take another class in something.
Okay, continuing education, lifespan, as we say. Mary Gilstrap, I don't think we've met, but perhaps we have, and you'll tell me. Unmute, Mary. You need to find.
Okay.
There you are.
So you probably haven't met me, but I've heard you speak several times at UU Marin, and I'm a member there, and I'm just very interested in UU history in general. And this book about the Bay Area looks fascinating to me.
Well, I'm glad you're here, Mary. I have a particular place in my heart for the fellowship in Marin. I stepped in there several times in recent years to plug holes in the preaching schedule, and I was just delighted to meet your newly called minister, who I think is going to be a tremendous contribution to Unitarian Universalism in the Bay Area. And Carolina, could you tell us a bit about yourself and where you are? That looks like Walden Pond behind you.
Yeah, but it's not a real Walden Pond. I'm in Rio, and I'm a member of a UUA group called Leadership and Design Team. And I joined because my references regarding Unitarian Universalism are mostly focused on 19th century New England and the whole higher criticism context. So I'm trying to go west in a way and understand a broader scope of references. So yeah.
Good. And Leo. You need to unmute, Leo.
Hi, I visited UU Church here in Walnut Creek, and very interesting to know about the context of history on this religion. So I look forward to the next few today and next few sections.
Oh, excellent. That's wonderful. And some of the issues having to do with early immigration of people from Asia will be quite salient in the coming session. So I'm delighted to have somebody of your background with us. And Mike.
Hello, I am a former longtime member of the San Francisco congregation and fan of yours. And about 10 years ago, I moved to Sonoma County, so I'm currently a member of the Unitarian Universalist congregation Santa Rosa. And I'm just a kind of history nut, so especially when it comes to Unitarian Universalist history and criticism thereof.
Yeah, excellent, Mike. Delighted you're with us. Now let's see. Gretchen's spoken. How about Marjorie Wallace?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm so happy to be here because I was lost in the Evite black hole because I never got a link or anything. But anyway, I'm so glad that was history. And I'm like Leo, I'm a member of the Mount Diablo Unitarian Universalist Church in Walnut Creek, and I've always loved history. So, and I hear about Starr King and, what a crucial role he played in keeping California out of the Confederacy. But I just am really fascinated in anticipation of what we're going to learn about. It just seemed when I taught Sunday school, it seemed like anybody who ever did anything worthwhile in our history was a Unitarian. So.
Well, that's the way we like to tell it, Marjorie. Yeah. little self-congratulatory.
Yeah.
Connie, introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Connie Chiba, and I'm also a member of the Walnut Creek UU. And, I've been a member almost 30 years. And I really don't know much about the history of UUs. It's never really interests me that much, but I thought, oh, you're giving it, and I'm more interested now. So I'm just here to
Good.
learn.
Well, I think that there are things that we can learn about our contemporary life in Unitarian Universalism that the history can inform. And one of them has to do with what really causes the ups and downs. As I indicated earlier, the basic thesis of this webinar overall in its all 6 sessions is that there are big forces out there that we don't always control. Although it's important for congregations to seize opportunities to clarify their mission and take advantage of the changes that are going on around them. And leadership is important, both lay and ordained. Now, have I missed anybody? Because I see 12 people on my screen, and I'm wondering if there's a second page or something somebody I haven't picked up on. No. All right. So let me begin a little bit with what I had hoped to do in the way of a PowerPoint presentation that just went into cyberspace when whatever happened So Gretchen, I want to explain that I am now doing this from my iPad, which I'm holding in my hands. Okay, my apologies if I go up and down and waver a bit. I'll try to be as steady as I can be while holding my head in the frame. All right, good. And thank you for making use of the chat. I encourage you to do that all the way through my presentation, because your questions and comments will help me understand where you are, what really interests you. I thought I would begin a little bit by saying that one of the stories that I'm going to be elucidating is the story of the Unitarians and Universalists right here in San Francisco, starting in 1850. This is from my new book called A Religious Center with a Civic Circumference, Unitarians in San Francisco since 1850. You'll notice I didn't put the Universalists in the title. And there's a simple reason for that. The congregation was formed as a Unitarian congregation with a heritage Universalist soon as its minister, namely Thomas Starr King. So there was only a very brief period in the 19th century when there was a Universalist presence organized in San Francisco, and that's in the 1870s. We'll get to that. Not this session, but next session. It's been mostly identified as a Unitarian church. In fact, Universalists didn't come into the name of the San Francisco congregation until the 1990s. Mike, you were probably a member at that point, right? No? Okay. Well, it was during the ministry of Margot Campbell Gross and John Marsh when the congregation did a major renovation of the building. And there was a question, what name are we going to put on the new outside? And
I was a member at that time, but I think the name change happened before that.
Yeah, not according to the public records. They may have begun to do it more informally, for all I know. But in 1992, 1993, the congregation voted to call itself the first Unitarian Universalist congregation of Society of San Francisco. So there's an interesting point. Society. Why not church or congregation or something else? Well, this goes back to the deep origins of the title that I took for my book, A Religious Center with a Civic Circumference. A lot of our Unitarian side of the family came from the establishment in New England, where you couldn't form a town in Massachusetts until you had a parish church. And by the time of the American Revolution, those old first parish in fill in the blank had all become Unitarian. First church in Boston, first parish in Plymouth, first parish in Concord, first church in Salem. Those seaport Unitarian congregations reflected the merchant class background of the Unitarian side of our family and their existence as an established church. Susan's nodding her head. She got this out of earlier classes, probably with Meg. Well, the Universalists were rather different. Although they also sort of broke with old Calvinism in New England during the American Revolution. They were much more sectarian. They were like the Baptists and the Shakers and the Quakers and other evangelicals, although their message was not, you're going to hell. It was, quit worrying. God loves us all. There's no eternal damnation. The Unitarian bell, the Universalist bell rings, no hell, no hell. All right. Now, my story of the church here in San Francisco begins with what I would describe as almost an accidental event. Imagine this. In the late summer of the year 1850, San Francisco has gone from being a little village of maybe 500 people 2 years before the discovery of gold, to being a ramshackle boom town with 25,000 people. Many of the early arrivals did not come overland by wagon train or otherwise. That was a very difficult journey. A lot of the early arrivals came by sea, and a lot of them were New Englanders. Because after all, the New Englanders were America's early merchant class going by sea, and by 1850, even developing what became the clipper ships that developed trade with India and China. I don't know who used the first term that these were the Argonauts, but it had to be somebody who had some classical education. Because if you know anything about the Greek myth of Jason and the Argonauts, he goes off in search of the Golden Fleece, which, by the way, was located probably in what's now Crimea on the Black Sea, that disputed territory between Russia and Ukraine. And the Argonauts were among the first arrivals following the gold rush. And the smartest of them were these New England merchants who didn't even bother going to the gold fields to see what they could do to dig gold out of the ground. They just came prepared to sell things to people who are going to be the diggers and the explorers and the gold miners. A great example of that is Captain McCondry, who becomes the first real patron of the congregation. He had made a fortune as a merchant in China. As I point out in my early chapter, partly because he ran a so-called depot ship off the coast of Macau, where merchants bringing in opium from India, which was not illegal then, except in China itself, they would drop their cargo at his ship, and people who were basically smugglers would come out to his ship. A very complicated trade arranged basically by the British, who were selling opium into China from India. McCondry goes back to Boston, having seen California and worrying about the fact that he had lifelong asthma, thinking, oh, that California environment, that'd be great for me. And once the gold is discovered, he comes out here and becomes one of the most important merchant bankers in the city in the 1850s. But the scene that I open with is about a fellow who is a Unitarian minister who, like a lot of the people who came out here during the gold rush, actually had not done very well in his profession. Charles Farley had failed by worldly standards anyway, as a Unitarian minister in places like Richmond, Virginia, where he managed to come down on both sides of the slavery issue. In Alton, Illinois, where he did it again. There are good and bad people on both sides. And then back to New England, where he tried to establish a Unitarian church in a place where the Universalists were already dominant, and then offended the Universalists. So Charles Farley is here in San Francisco. He's bought a share in a New England-based merchant mining company that people bought for a couple of $100 the right to sail on the ship that they had chartered, come out to San Francisco and try their luck in this gold rush boomtown. The minute the ship got into harbor, everybody broke apart. There was no unified effort. This was very common. San Francisco Harbor in the early 1849 and 1850 was full of abandoned ships where even the sailors and the captains and everybody went to the gold fields and just abandoned the ships. And previous agreements of cooperation, every man for himself. Farley, as a classically educated minister who had filled in between his pastorates, teaching Greek and Latin, I think may have been the guy who first coined the term, I came with the Argonauts. I'm not sure. I would wish that Charles Fracchia, who was the founder of the San Francisco Historical Society and named its quarterly journal, The Argonaut, was still alive in order to help me answer that question, but he died while I was writing the book. Charles Farley's walking down the street in this town that is made up of tents, abandoned ships, and wooden frame buildings built out of the planks pried up from the ships. And he goes by a ramshackle building that calls itself Quoddy House. Well, that was the name of an inn on Passamaquoddy Bay in Maine, where he had, for a time in Eastport, been the Unitarian minister until, well, the boom broke there. They had been having a boom in Maine, deforesting the virgin forests of Maine. And Eastport had a boom period as a little seaport, and then it collapsed, and so did the Unitarian Church there. And Charles Farley comes out to San Francisco, and what? Somebody knows about Quoddy House in Eastport? He goes in, and it's one of his former parishioners. You can't make this stuff up. Moreover, the guy says, we've got to have a Unitarian church out here. This is chaos. And Unitarians stand for some civic order. Indeed, in New England, every parish church that was Unitarian was at the center of the town and saw its mission as not just the religious conversion of individual souls and families to right living and right relations with others. They also saw their mission as tied in with trying to create a whole community, a wider civic community of right relations and good human order. That's where I got the title. Although it comes primarily from a Unitarian minister in the early 20th century in Indianapolis, Indiana, it's a good summary of what those old New England churches were all about. Religious centers with a civic circumference. And Charles Farley, I call the accidental minister. He didn't come here to be a minister. And when he didn't go to the goldfields, he used his Greek and Latin to get himself a job clerking in a pharmacy, where everything that was on sale had some pretentious Greek or Latin name to it. And that's what he was doing when his former congregant says, we've got to have a Unitarian church, and keeps bugging him until he introduces him to Captain McCondry and to a fellow who owns the largest public hall in the city at the time, Simmons Athenaeum. And in October of 1850, Charles Farley, quite reluctantly, because he doesn't have any old sermons, he doesn't have a library, and he's quite scholarly, sits down and writes a Unitarian sermon, and son of a gun, a couple of hundred people show up. All men. Not a single woman. That was San Francisco in 1850. There were almost no women. maybe 3% of the 25,000 population. Almost all white, although some from places like Chile. Number of ruffians from Australia who had been freed from the criminal charges that the British had sent them there with. It was a rough town. And by the way, between 1850 and 1853, downtown San Francisco practically burned to the ground 6 times. Simmons Athenaeum burned to the ground not long after the Unitarians held their first meetings there. But 25 rather respectable merchant types and lawyers and doctors stayed after the service and organized the first Unitarian Society of San Francisco with the mission of being a religious center that would kind of tame this frontier chaos, which included rampant violence on the streets, no real organized government, corruption that was staggering in its dimensions. And Farley only agreed to stay for about 6 months. I don't know if he ever told the other guys that he had a wife and child back in Boston, but that's what he returned to. And by the way, he never tried to be a Unitarian minister after that. He went back to teaching Greek and Latin. That's why I connect him with the term that the early settlers out here were Argonauts. Well, let me just now pause for a minute and ask if any of you can say anything that you remember from your wider history about the 1850s. Don't be shy. So California comes into the Union in 1850 as part of a big political compromise. Remember that? Which includes a vicious fugitive slave law. One of the things that's happening in America culturally is a deepening of the divide between North, South, and West, largely over slavery. The economics are pretty boom because the end of the Mexican War, which is what brought California into possession of the United States, the Mexican War was the United States taking away the top 55% of the country of Mexico. That and the discovery of gold caused a kind of nationwide economic explosion. Technology was contributing to it. The spread of steamships, railroads, telegraphs, of new invention. All very important in this time. But the Western Pacific coast was completely, well, they would have said uncivilized. Partly because, of course, they considered uncivilized all of the indigenous people who already lived here. And don't get me going on the assumption by almost everyone that people of European heritage from the East were predestined to dominate and to eliminate the native population. 1850 is already into what becomes known as the California Genocide. It starts around 1846. One of the worst episodes is up near Yosemite. It's led by John C. Fremont. We still have towns named after him. And by the way, he shows up in 1860 owning a pew in the Unitarian Church. Nobody, with very few exceptions, expected the native population to do anything except die out and disappear. And by the way, they did everything possible to displace them, enslave them, and the like. California comes into the Union as a nominally free state, but one of the first things that the legislature does is pass the so-called Indian Act, which says that unless an Indian's got a job, he or she or the child is to be considered a vagrant and can be simply put into a forcible indenture and sold. The population of indigenous people in California went from probably in excess of 500,000 down to, at this point, maybe 100 and some thousand. And by the time of the Civil War, half of that. Disease, genocide, enslavement. It's just one of the ugliest stories you can imagine. By the way, there's a new book out called California, a Slave State. I'm about to write a review of it. It's not entirely, I have some objections here and there. I don't think that the author does much more than lift up all of the ain't it awfuls without doing much about the people who raised objections. And that's my principal objection to her book. But it's certainly part of the truth. So that's part of the context in California, but it's going on all around the world. This is the age of European colonialism at its height, pushing into Africa, South Asia, East Asia. It's the Opium Wars in China. It's the East India Company dealing with the India Mutiny or the Sepoy Rebellion in the 1850s in India. It's the Crimean War with Imperial Russia being fought by Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire. If you don't know this while you are thinking about what's going on in Crimea and Ukraine today, you're not adequately informed. If you don't think about the early Western context with China in the context of our current polarization with communist China, you're not thinking historically enough. Speaking of communism, another background to California, the United States liberal religion in the 1850s is the failure of the European revolutions of 1848, into which Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels published their Communist Manifesto. Unitarian feminist Margaret Fuller is there in Rome during the short-lived Roman Republic that threw the Pope out, only to watch the French under Napoleon III come in with an army and restore the Pope and end the Republic, sending her and her revolutionary Italian husband and their child back to America, where they tragically die in 1850 in a shipwreck on Fire Island in New York. Had Margaret survived, she probably would have become the chairperson of the first National Women's Rights Convention in Worcester, Massachusetts, held later that year in 1850. So one has to contextualize everything that's going on in a given church, both nationally and internationally, culturally and politically. Here's a real tough question for all of you. Who can tell me who was the president of the United States in 1850? Silence
Is it
in the
Polk
classroom.
or is it Polk or the next one?
Not you're about 10 years too early,
Oh, okay.
Caroline. Who's the president? It's not Polk. You're right. He starts the war with Mexico. But he's then succeeded by the general who was the hero of the Mexican War, Zachary Taylor, who was the shortest lived president of the United States. He caught pneumonia while he was giving his inaugural address in 1849 and died 30 days later, and was succeeded by the 13th president of the United States. Come on, you should know this guy. Barbara, you're smiling. Do you know who he was?
No, I was gonna look it up on Google.
John Tyler, no.
Millard Fillmore, Unitarian, lawyer from Buffalo, New York, who signed the Fugitive Slave Law. And by the way, also sent Commodore Perry to forcibly open Japan to Western commerce. This is the context. Fillmore, among other things, was dealing with a huge anti-immigrant movement. Does this sound familiar? 1.5 million Irish immigrants fleeing the potato famine had come to the United States between 1845 and 1855. The reaction in eastern seaport cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia was vicious. Anti-Irish riots, the rise of an anti-immigrant movement called the Know Nothings, that only people who were born here in the United States should be allowed to vote or have any public privileges. Does any of that sound familiar? It becomes so overwhelming that in 1854, the Know Nothings swept all of the elections in Massachusetts, controlled the governorship and 85% of the legislature, with anti-Irish, anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant sentiment. And of course, 1854 is when the Kansas-Nebraska Act is passed, voiding the Missouri Compromise, which tried to balance Northern interests against Southern interests, and opens Kansas and Nebraska to popular sovereignty or a fight over whether they're going to be slave or free states. Bleeding Kansas, John Brown and the Potawatomi Massacre. The polarization of this period is so deep that I think it exceeds that of the 1960s, which I lived through. But the present polarization in the United States is coming close, because it's regional and it's also urban versus rural. Urbanization is happening during the 1850s. And by the way, the Universalists had built their whole movement on rural churches. And small town and white or rurally distributed newspapers, almost every Universalist minister in the 1830s published his or her own newspaper. There were a few male-female couples in the Universalist movement, even that early. And, you know, he would preach and she would publish the newspaper. By the 1850s, women are coming into their own a little bit more with the women's rights movement. But the urbanization and differentiation of the economies of the North and the South becomes just huge. The amount of American capital invested in enslaved persons is so huge that it is probably the largest single investment in the American economy. Roughly $4 billion in 1850s money tied up in human property. Well, one of the purposes of history is, if you think things are bad now, study a little history and the forces that our forebears were up against in their time. By the way, be grateful for what you've got in the way of healthcare, because back in the 1850s, zilch. Nobody really had any decent alternatives for the huge amounts of infectious disease. I did my earlier book on the Transcendentalists in the 1840s and 50s, and God, there wasn't a one of them that didn't have a child die of infectious disease. And imagine California in the 1850s with very few healthcare facilities of any sort. And again, people dying quite regularly of polluted water, infectious disease of one sort or another. All right, let me pause for a moment. How does it happen that in all of this, we're moving toward one of the most influential periods of liberal religion in the history of the United States? It's not that things were going all that well organizationally, either among Universalists or Unitarians. In the 1850s, the Universalists were fighting one another over differences in theology. Some of them were so-called ultra-Universalists, who said, when you die, you go straight to God's love. That was the position of important Universalist founder Hosea Ballou. And one of his most influential publicists in the 1840s and 50s, who was also a banker and a real estate entrepreneur, Whittemore, Thomas Whittemore. But a lot of people said, wait a minute. You mean that there isn't even a naughty step that people have to sit on after they die to think about what they did wrong? Many of the Universalists said there probably should be. Eventually, God wants everybody reconciled to one another and with the divine. but it may take some thinking and some repentance, if not in this life, then in the next. These were restorationists. And their position was that the love of God can't be seen as limited. It's universal. But the ultimate restoration of all people to the goodness and presence of God depends on their acceptance of goodness in their own souls. By the way, this was very close to what many of the Unitarians were preaching at the same time. So that was the restorationists who were becoming closer to the Unitarians. And some of the Universalists were actually leaving the Universalist movement and becoming Unitarians. People like Thomas Starr King, Aidan Ballou, whose book on non-resistance, a pacifist tract, and whose foundation of the Hopedale community, a utopian community, was very influential in and picked up by people going down through Leo Tolstoy, Mahatma Gandhi, and Martin Luther King. But the Universalists were divided. And by the way, starting about 1848, many of them were becoming spiritualists. Because if your soul is still around after you die, but troubled, trying to figure out how to find goodness, ultimate goodness, maybe that's why we are sometimes haunted by the sense of presence of those who have died, with whom we still have a spiritual connection. Nearly 40% of American Universalists in the 1840s and 50s became spiritualists, including many of the clergy who actually left the churches to become spiritualist lecturers. So you have a threefold divide going on among the Universalists. And they're kind of stuck. They had been expanding quite rapidly. At one point, they were called the seventh largest denomination. They had claimed to have so many people under influence, but that was mostly through their distribution of their newspapers and the consolidation of the press and the urbanization that's going on. And as for the Unitarians, do you know that in 1850, there were only about 200 Unitarian churches? They were almost entirely in New England and in major commercial centers and seaports. In the South, you could find Unitarian churches in places like Charleston, South Carolina, Mobile, Alabama, New Orleans, but nothing inland. Oh, well, there was a church in Cincinnati and one in St. Louis. Again, all on trade routes, all dominated by merchant class people who used well-educated, Harvard-educated ministers to do historical criticism of the Bible. And while the Universalists were largely not college educated and looking at the Bible still rather literally, rather than in historical or critical context. So there are class differences and there are educational differences between the two movements, but neither was doing terribly well in 1850. By the end of the 1850s, Henry Whitney Bellows, arguably the most successful Unitarian minister in the country with a big church in New York City, gives a divinity school address that's kind of a counterpoint to Emerson's famous divinity school address, in which he says, look, we've taken individualism way too far. We've taken Protestantism way too far. We need to be better stewards of the small c Catholic tradition of Christianity that is inclusive, and we need to be more institutional. He called it the suspensive faith. So what's going on out here? Well, with all of these New Englanders and their desire to bring order out of chaos, and many of them as successful merchants, by 1854, after the city had burned 3 or 4 times, they are raising a brick fireproof structure on Stockton Street that seats 1,000 people, and they're advertising East as an opportunity for a Unitarian minister to come out and serve them, the largest and wealthiest congregation in the city. But back to the issues of disease. The first fellow who accepts their call, Reverend Buckingham from Hartford, Connecticut, comes out via Panama, which was the best way to come during that era, goes overland and catches yellow fever, arrives in San Francisco, preaches for 3 weeks, and dies. The challenges of serving a ministry out here on the frontier during that period were just huge. One fellow named Cutler, Rufus Cutler, managed to hang on for the latter part of the 1850s for 4 years, despite the fact that he was a very quiet, very scholarly, not very charismatic fellow, never married. At one of the congregational meetings, a guy stands up and says, because by this time, the wealthy merchants are beginning to import their families, including McCondry, for example, whose wife and children formed the core of the Sunday school and everything else. There's an urgent need for the formation of another committee. They had just appointed a committee of 5 to do this and a committee of 3 to do that. We need a committee of 1, and I nominate our pastor, Reverend Cutler, to institute the search for a pastor's wife, of which the church is in great need. I don't think labels having to do with sexual orientation from the 20th century and the 21st century are very applicable during this period. But let's just point out that Rufus Cutler never married. And he was not interested in finding a Mrs. Cutler. And he went back east. It was in the absence of a settled minister in a congregation that had become the largest and wealthiest congregation in the city. 1,000 people in the largest public building in the city on Stockton Street. That the search goes out that ends with Thomas Starr King. So I think I've covered the 1850s and what was going on with liberal religion, and particularly here in San Francisco during that period. And this is where I have to temper my thesis that it's politics, culture, economics that control, and say that it is also necessary to have effective and even charismatic leadership with a clear sense of mission if a congregation or a religious movement is going to really take off and be transformative. Thomas Starr King arrives in San Francisco with his wife and daughter Edith in April of 1860. Mind you, the Civil War does not break out until the following winter with the firing on Fort Sumter. But it is very clear that the preservation of the Union is the issue in the balance. The worst presidential administration in American history, until the one that began about not too long ago, was the presidential administration of James Buchanan, who did absolutely nothing to prevent the dissolution of the Union and the separation of the North and South. Ineffectual doesn't quite cover his administration. Starr King, which included the real death knell to the effort to hold the Union together, namely the Dred Scott decision of 1857. When I think about the Dobbs decision recently, the Dred Scott decision comes to mind because very rarely has the United States Supreme Court done things that have rolled back human rights. But Dobbs certainly did. Just as Dred Scott did this awful thing of saying that Dred and his wife, who had been enslaved people in Missouri, when taken to Minnesota, did not become free because they'd been taken to a free territory. Well, no, they had no right to come into court at all because they were just property. And that people of their color could never become citizens. That was 7-2, the decision of the United States Supreme Court, 1857. My last book, Conflagration: How the Transcendentalists Sparked the American Struggle for Racial, Gender, and Social Justice, takes its title in part from a poem written by Frederick Douglass in response to the Dred Scott decision, in which he says essentially that the whole South is going to have to be wrapped in wild conflagration in order to purge the United States of its original sin of slavery, prophesying the Civil War. When Starr King comes here, he comes with a fairly clear sense of mission, that it has to do not just with building the Unitarian Church in the city, but actually with bringing more of New England culture and the preservation of the Union to a city and a place where pro-slavery people dominated. In 1858, in response to the Dred Scott decision, 800 African Americans in the Bay Area gave up on the United States and took ship for Canada. They moved from here to Victoria, British Columbia. Mary Ellen Pleasant, who was the one African American woman in the area who had actually come with some money and made even more money, but had to hide the fact that she had any, took money out to John Brown to help him organize his slave rebellion. But the worst public event in California during that period is probably the death of US Senator David Broderick, shot and killed in a duel with David Terry, the sometime Chief Justice of California, two Democrats, both in a party that was loosely held together. What was the argument between them? Terry said that Broderick was not pro-slavery enough. And the Democrats controlled the governorship, the legislature, and every other public office in the state. Let's not disturb the issue of slavery. Let's let people just vote about it. Versus, I want to see slavery expanded. Meanwhile, the genocide of the Native Americans is going on. That's the atmosphere that Starr King arrives in. The second week he preached, Jessie Benton Fremont and her husband, John C. Fremont, showed up to hear him and immediately rented a pew in the Stockton Street Church. They were nominally Episcopalians, but they found Starr King's approach to liberal Christianity and his mission of preserving the Union exactly what they wanted to help promote. Fremont, of course, had been the first limit slavery Republican candidate for the United States presidency in 1856. Couldn't even carry California, where he'd been a senator. The great Western explorer was very mixed track record on Native American issues. He would promote treaties, but the United States Senate wouldn't adopt them. And his wife, Jessie, was the far better politician than he was. There's a close bond that forms between Thomas Starr King and Jessie Benton Fremont. I've just finished transcribing all of the letters from Jessie Benton Fremont to Thomas Starr King, which his previous biographers I don't think have even looked at. They're at the Society of California Pioneers library here in San Francisco. And one of the things that Starr King never gets credit for is he not only worked with Jessie Benton Fremont to keep California in the Union, and by the way, to get Abraham Lincoln won the California 4 electoral votes in 1860 by 722 votes. That's how close it was. It was a plurality. He got 32.8% of the vote and the 4 electoral votes. Southern Democrats, Northern Democrats, and a so-called Constitutional Union Party were all on the ballot as well. But when the election is over, Jessie Benton Fremont and Thomas Starr King are arguably 2 of the most important political people in California, along with a fellow named Baker, Edward Baker, who, although he was basically based here in the Bay Area, gets elected the US Senator from Oregon and sent out to represent Oregon in the United States Senate. Mount Baker. He dies early in the Civil War. Jessie and Thomas Starr King start the first real intellectual salon on the West Coast. It includes young writer Bret Harte. One of the things I discovered about him was that he's probably one of the first people who really speaks up against the Native American genocide. He's in his early 20s. He's a journalist up in Northern California on the coast, almost on the Oregon border. And he witnesses a absolutely gratuitous massacre of some 300 Native Americans organized by local ranchers who were just after their land, and denounces it in print, and of course gets run out of town. Comes to San Francisco, joins the Unitarian Church because Starr King looks like the closest thing to a real anti-racist that the state has, marries the alto in the choir, and with Jesse Fremont, though these three people form a group that includes scientists, artists, the pioneer landscape photographer Carlton Watkins. And by the way, Starr King was no slouch at writing and at natural history. Just before coming out here, he had published a very successful book called The White Hills, the White Mountains, we now call them, of New Hampshire. The White Hills, they're poetry, legends, and landscapes. And he's being encouraged to write a book about the Sierras that will be similar. So he goes up to Yosemite. Within 3 months of arriving in San Francisco, this was not easy to do. It was expensive, it was distant, it took 6 days. And he's writing back to the Boston Evening Transcript about, you think your hills in New Hampshire are impressive? You should see Yosemite and the Sierras. He gets Carlton Watkins to go up there and the next year take the first mammoth photographs of Yosemite. So the two things that I think Starr King never gets credit for are his importance in starting a real sense of a Western intellectual, reflective intelligentsia. And his role, along with Carlton Watkins, in publicizing the splendors and sublime landscapes of Yosemite. And 3 months after he dies, and still with the Civil War still going on, the US Congress sets aside Yosemite as a public park, practically in Starr King's memory. My friend Tyler Green, who's the biographer of Carlton Watkins, is about to come out with a book called The Battle for Yosemite that shows that his transcendentalist appreciation for nature was the real spark behind the preservation of that remarkable place. By the way, Starr King only has a 4-year ministry here in San Francisco, a little less than that, actually. He arrives in April of 1860 and dies in March of 1864, having absolutely worn himself out, especially raising money for the US Sanitary Commission, which his friend Henry Whitney Bellows chaired, and which became the first really huge national humanitarian effort in American history. I was just glancing at one of my earlier books about how the Sanitary Commission idea got started. Elizabeth Blackwell, who was one of the first women physicians in the United States, was a Unitarian and a member of Bellows' congregation in New York City. And when the Union Army started a training camp on Staten Island, she went out there and was appalled at the conditions where, even before going to battle, soldiers were dying of disease because they were putting their latrines uphill from the water source. Food was despicable. There was no differentiation between those who were sick and those who were not. And 4,000 Unitarian women filled the Cooper Union Hall, 4,000 women, led by Unitarians and their influential friends, and formed a petition to the Congress, which Bellows took, demanding that the soldiers be given a better health care, basically. And this Unitarian-led humanitarian effort, did a couple of things that we should look back on. It taught Unitarians that they could organize, that they could use their relative economic and social privilege in a way that would be of enormous benefit to people who didn't have much. All these farmers' kids who were coming to be soldiers and who were dying of disease, that they could raise tons of money, millions. Thomas Starr King raised the equivalent of what today would be almost $1 billion out of the gold fields of California and from the merchants that came out here. And one of the things I discovered was a letter from Bellows in which he says, "My friends on Wall Street tell me that it's the flow of gold from California for the Union cause that is convincing the British bankers not to back the South, but to expect the North to win." And Thomas Starr King does things like, in 1862, go all the way up to British Columbia to visit those African Americans who had fled the Bay Area and who had sent him $1,000 for the Union cause. One African American historian out here has said that he was probably the only truly authentic white anti-racist in the state in the 1860s. I would have to say that's not entirely true. He was utterly obtuse to the issues being faced by Asian immigrants and by Native Americans. But when on August the 1st, 1860, he spoke to the entire African American populace of San Francisco on Emancipation Day, they wept because they had in him an articulate and powerful white ally. So the first great influential period in liberal religious history in the United States is ironically during a civil war. Unitarians and Universalists really unite behind the Sanitary Commission. Mary Livermore, an early feminist pioneer among Universalists, was the head of fundraising in the Midwest in Chicago. Starr King raised almost half of the money that funded this huge humanitarian effort. And the story of the 1850s and 60s out here is, I think, a powerful one in just helping us to assess what does it take to have liberal religion really be transformative on the American scene. It suggests to me that yes, effective charismatic leadership, not always the most radical. By the way, Thomas Starr King was very adroit in his keeping California in the Union. A lot of his speeches were kind of wrap yourself in the flag patriotism things. They were about George Washington and how Washington freed his slaves when he died and fought to form the Union, and we mustn't give up on the Union. Thousands of people came to hear him on those themes. He was adroit enough not to be how shall I say, overtly partisan. he suggested that the people who disappointed him were the secessionists, who were selfish and pro-slavery. But he took the high ground. Reminds me of Michelle Obama, you know, when they go low, we go high. So I'm going to stop there. I think I probably rambled on for close to the entire time allotted. But this first session, and by golly, I'm promising you that next Sunday night, I will have the technological things fixed. But there's a little time here for comments and questions. Anybody, please. Unmute yourself and just have at me.
Right, so I have to say, learning all that about how San Francisco pulled itself together to keep calling ministers from New England, there had to be such a strong body, such a kernel of commitment to have liberal religion be in San Francisco and all of that chaos. I mean, minister after minister after minister, they just kept it going. I had to say, just so powerful. I'm so inspired by those folks, those congregants. The congregants are the ones who created it.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't even go into the assassination of one of the Unitarian trustees in 1856. James King of William, who is an editor of a local newspaper, is a trustee of the Unitarian Church, and he discovers that there's this guy who's only been here a year, who's already managed to get himself elected to the city council. And he's got his own newspaper. What's going on with this guy? And he digs into it a little, and the fellow turns out to be a complete fraud who had come here via a little institution in New York called Sing Sing, where he had been imprisoned for fraud and grand larceny. James Casey. How did he get elected to the city council? Oh, he bribed the sheriff, who stuffed the ballot box. And the entire merchant class, Casey shoots him on the street. So you have this Unitarian editor who's being publicly assassinated, and the entire merchant class rises up and said, "We've had it." The sheriff's a crook. The city council is packed with crooks. We're throwing them all out. The so-called Committee of Vigilance was 8,000 merchant class people who ran the city for about 6 months. And then when they decided they needed to put things on a more stable basis, they arranged for Ephraim Burr, who was a merchant and later a member of the Unitarian congregation, to become the new mayor and to consolidate city and county government so that there would never, after that, be a separate board of supervisors and a city council and a sheriff. And yeah, goes all the way back to that. Let's see, somebody had something in the chat that I didn't quite catch. Anybody else?
You mentioned during the time 1850, UU people or Unitarian were excellent organizer, and
they were
fundraising. And can you elaborate more why they were able to do so?
Some of it, frankly, Leo, is social class privilege. The Unitarians were primarily merchants. There were many of them had higher levels of education. They were able to form not only organizations for humanitarian purposes, they easily formed organizations for business purposes. So when you get a city Chamber of Commerce going. Guess what? It's run by Unitarians. By 1860 in San Francisco, the Unitarians were the most highly respected civic leaders in town.
They were organizing universities as well, right?
Not quite yet. We'll get to that next time, Mike, but you're exactly right that in the next phase, after the Civil War, they really go into founding both the University of California and Stanford. In the 1850s, what they started was called the College of California. And it was a men's school. And quite small. And actually not in San Francisco, because you wouldn't want the young men being educated close to the Barbary Coast. So it was across the bay in Oakland. But Thomas Starr King was one of the early trustees, and his successor, Horatio Stebbins, whom we'll get to next time, builds on the College of California and works with a member of his congregation, who's now the governor, Frederick Lowe, to turn the College of California into the University of California. That's a fascinating story. But you're right. They're also the people who are very interested in what I would call cultural improvement. Thomas Starr King said he wanted to New Englandize the culture of California and get everybody reading the Atlantic. And his parishioner, Bret Hart, starts the first literary quarterly out here on the West Coast. And all of the interchange, all of the poets and writers who grow up in the Bay Area are influenced by the Unitarians, whether they're actually members of the congregation or not. The first poet laureate of California. Oh God, I'm going to block on her name now. She was actually the niece of the Mormon prophet Joseph Smith. And she took a different name. She becomes also the first public librarian in Oakland and a mentor to a whole generation of further writers like Joaquin Miller, Jack London, and so forth. So there's one of the things that gets launched during this period is not just religious influence, but cultural influence and educational influence that's truly transformative. Serena, you'll appreciate the fact that she was the librarian.
Were Unitarians involved in the eugenics movement?
So that's much later, Mike. That comes up in the early 20th century, and you're right. It's a pseudo-science, Ina Coolbrith. Thank you, Carolina. That's the librarian that I was thinking of, the poet. She wrote a poem about the death of Thomas Starr King. Early in the 20th century, you get some pseudo-scientific movements that are provoked by Darwinism, and eugenics is among them. And that's a tawdry story, but we'll get into it. All right, friends, I think the covenant has been 90 minutes. And I think I've exhausted it. And I do apologize for this technological glitch. I'm glad that we have a limited number of people. I'm going to see if we can't arrange for the next session, Kelly, to be set up more in a seminar fashion so that everybody can participate right from the start.
We can do
And
it.
I will have both the slide deck that I intended to present this evening and one for the next session. And I look forward to seeing all of you. And by the way, you can still let friends know that they are welcome to this relatively small group. And I will enjoy the interchange with all of you about how we can gain some insights into how to best promote good civic and liberal religious values in the world we live in today by studying the religious center with a civic circumference that the church in San Francisco represents in its own history. As long as we keep paying attention to evolving historical, political, cultural, technological, economic context, today rapidly changing, and how important it is to have mission-focused, effective leadership as liberal religion itself evolves in the world that we share. And with that, a benediction. Thank you for joining me this evening. See you again next Sunday evening. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
John.
Thank you, John. Take care.
Thank you, John. Thank you so much. I'm so sorry about all the issues.
Yeah, well, the big one for me is what the hell happened to my computer?
I know, I checked with Xander. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm just gonna have to have my techie. Yeah, I've got a guy who supports me, but I'll have to get a hold of him tomorrow and see what he can do with it.
John, if, just in case something happens, if you want to email me your PowerPoint, we can arrange something like
Oh,
that. I
okay.
can share the screen.
Yeah, but it's on the computer, on the hard drive of the computer, and it's not on my iPad.
Okay.
So,
Right.
And the other thing is, everyone's gonna come in as if it were the webinar, but like we did today, we'll just make everyone a panelist as they come in.
okay, that's fine. All right, see you again next week.
Thank you
Thank
so
you
much.
so much. Thank you,
Take care.
Kelly.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you, Meg. Bye.